Hello, students of World History 1102. Uh, Before we go into today's lecture about imperialism in South Asia, I want to speak to you about what's going to be happening in the class next week. First of all, I hope all of you are safe and well. Um, me and my family are okay at this point. Um, Anyways, this is going to be our last recorded lecture for a while. And as you've noticed, it's on Kaltura. It's actually in the Blackboard documents section now. But moving forward, starting next week, we are going to go to synchronous lectures on a platform known as Zoom. Some of you have probably been already using this in some of your other classes, but we're going to try it out next week. And I'm going to send you some instructions as well as a URL this weekend about how to tune in and be part of the synchronous lecture. In other words, a synchronous lecture will be one that's in real time and you will watch it. And I will be there and I can answer questions and we can run a virtual classroom that way. And we will be doing these Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at our usual time of 10 to 10:50, unless you're otherwise notified. So stay tuned to your Blackboard announcements, and I'll be sending you some instructions on how to use Zoom, and you'll also be receiving a discrete and specific URL that will take you to our virtual classroom starting again on Monday, which Monday is let me look at my calendar here, Monday the 24th. We will be in a virtual classroom via Zoom. That said, let us begin discussing the lecture for this week. Let me go into that. This is on South Asia and the Age of Imperialism. This is sort of the second lecture. You've already seen the first one posted earlier. So last time we talked about empires in general, their meaning, their significance. Today we're going to sort of apply what we talked about in terms of empires generally to the specific case of the British in India, probably the greatest and most obvious example of imperialism during the height of European imperialism in the 19th century. India was considered the crown jewel of the British Empire, and of course the British Empire was the largest overseas empire in world history. So we're going to take a look. First, we're going to go take a look a little bit who was ruling India before the British came there. Who were the Mughals, a Muslim sort of a Muslim empire that ruled over much of India prior to the British, from the 1500s through the 1700s. We're going to take a look at how European traders came to dominate trade in India and in the Indian Ocean basin. That was kind of the early penetration of Europeans into that area and how they came to dominate trade. What role the East India Company played in the British conquest of India. That in fact, India at first was really kind of a colony of a private English corporation that was doing the British monarch's bidding, but was still a private company. We'll take a look at what the Great Sepoy Rebellion of 1857 was. Sepoys were Indian soldiers within the British Army who rebelled, or the British called it a mutiny in 1857, and how that led to direct British colonial rule. In other words, the British government taking India away from the East India Company and ruling it directly. We'll take a look at how the British utilized their power to undermine the Indian textile industry and to reorient it towards imports of British textile goods and the extraction of resources from India, particularly cotton resources, because that's really kind of what empires are all about, right? Is a way to economic reasons for empire, of course, are to provide a market for goods from the home country and then as a source of cheap raw materials from the colonies. And the British experience in India is kind of the classic example of that. And finally, we'll take a look at what is the British legacy in modern independent India. Although we'll be looking at Indian liberation from British rule I think in a 4 or 5 weeks. I can't remember when, but it'll be like the last couple of weeks of the semester. We're taking at liberation movements around the world, and of course, we'll look at India's the Indian liberation movement under the leadership of Gandhi and Nehru. But that's something later in the course. So let's take a look at the Mughals, and let's take a look at India prior to British rule. As with virtually all of South Asia and the Middle East, in the 1500s, 1600s or so, India was largely ruled from the 1500s by one of the three great Turkic ethnic Muslim empires. These were empires ruled by people of Turkic background, and the Mughal Empire in India, that covered much of India, was one of three of these great Turkic Muslim empires. The others were the Ottomans, who ruled much of what is known as much of the Middle East and southeastern Europe. There were the Safavids, who ruled over Persia, or modern-day Iran. And, of course, the third one was the Mughals in India. These empires had risen up in the wake of the collapse of the great Mongol Empire that had kind of ruled much of Asia in the late 1200s and 1300s, and then quickly collapsed upon itself. The Mughals had kind of poured out of Central Asia and came to rule virtually all of the Asian landmass from China. They controlled China all the way through to the gates of Europe. And when they collapsed in the 1300s and 1400s, they were replaced by these great Turkic-speaking Islamic empires, and the Mughals were the largest of these in terms of the population. They ruled over much of India from the 1500s to the 1700s. And here's a map of those three great empires, the Ottomans, the Safavid, and the Mughals. They're called the gunpowder empires, of course, because they were the first empires to widely utilize gunpowder as a means of conquering other peoples and establishing their rule as empire. And as you can see from this map, the Mughal Empire between 1526 and 1707 grew from its original location in what is now modern-day Afghanistan, and began to expand across the Indian subcontinent, ultimately ruling virtually all of South Asia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, those modern-day countries. The only exception is the very southern tip of India and the island nation of Sri Lanka. Today it's called the island nation of Sri Lanka. At the time it was known as Ceylon. And so the Mughals ruled over all of this territory. Under a series of rather enlightened rulers, the Mughals organized an elaborate administration to run things: finances, army, infrastructure. They basically, and they did this in a kind of typical way of many empires, not administering things directly themselves. There weren't enough of these Mughal Muslim conquerors. So what they utilized was local Hindu regimes, local Hindu princes and others, to rule over India kind of in their place. So the Mughals sort of controlled the overall structure of their empire, but they relied very much on local Hindu rulers to administer this empire that they had expanded throughout much of India. And in utilizing these Hindu rulers, the Mughals basically took advantage of a very long-standing social hierarchy system in India known as the caste system. The caste system goes back thousands of years to the invasion of India by Aryan peoples from Central Asia in the second millennium BC. By the 1500s of the modern era, Common Era, AD, when the Mughals came to rule India, it had hardened into a rigid set of inherited classes and had been sanctified by the Hindu faith. Various powers that have ruled India, including the Mughal and later the British, used castes as an organization tool, giving the high castes, the Brahmins and the Kshatras, the power to rule over the lower castes, further hardening caste identity by giving it the approval of the government. with all the powers of law and control that goes with government power. And so they kind of reinforced the caste system by favoring Brahmins and Kshatras. The Mughals did this, and the British did this. Again, this is kind of typical of empires. They don't necessarily try to completely remake societies. That would be too difficult. It wouldn't be, profitable for them. It's just it costs too much to try to restructure everything. So they sort of take what social structures that already exist, place themselves at the top, and utilize those social structures to reinforce their own rule. That's how empires typically work. That's how the Mughals operated, and that's ultimately how the British would operate as well. And the early Mughal emperors were quite enlightened, and they tended to be rather open to various ethnic and religious strains, with a couple of exceptions. Most of the emperors kind of left things as they were in India, the social structure there. They did not try to convert the masses of India. And in fact, by the time the British take over India completely in the late 1700s and early 1800s, at least as we'll see, the East India Company doing that, just 15 to 20% of the Indian subcontinent were practitioners of Islam. And this is very different from other areas where Muslim invaders had conquered in early periods that became predominantly Muslim. Again, in India, the conversion rate was relatively low at 15 to 20%, and that's down to today in India, that Muslims represent a minority of about 15 to 20% of the population. Increasingly, though, the Mughal empires in the 17th century began to alienate the native Indian population in several ways. So they kind of moved from a laissez-faire attitude of just letting the Indian social structure continue, not trying to convert too many people. And by the late 17th century, a number of Mughal emperors began to alienate the native Indian population in a number of ways. One was their constant warfare to expand their holdings, which proved both destructive and costly, forcing peasants and others in India to pay higher taxes. Second, the Mughals were always great builders. The results of their obsession with creating massive architectural monuments are quite magnificent. The new capital of Delhi, for example, that they created by Shah Jahan, had among its what is known as the Great Fort, the Great Red Fort, which can still be visited today. This massive complex of administrative buildings and military structures that covers acres and acres of land in the modern-day city of Delhi. And by the time it was completed in the 17th century, as I said, it had thousands of rooms and housed over 50,000 members of the imperial household and servants. And of course, all of this had to be paid for by taxes paid by Indian peasants. And so this was a kind of an increasing exploitation of the Indian masses by their Mughal rulers. And of course, the most predominant expression of this Mughal desire for great building structures is located in Agra, where Shah Jahan built what architectural historians and ordinary tourists, for that matter, consider one of the most beautiful buildings in the world, the Taj Mahal, a tomb for Shah Jahan's favorite wife, who had died in childbirth, her 15th time giving birth. And the cost of this construction also added to the tax burdens and corvées on ordinary Indians. And again, we talked about corvées before. Corvées are basically, imagine sort of a military draft, except that when you're drafting peasants instead of drafting peasants into an army, you're drafting them to work on infrastructure projects like this tomb, like the Taj Mahal, for many months at a time with basically no pay. They're just sort of constricted into the army, into these laboring armies as opposed to military armies. So these were becoming more and more predominant in India under the late Mughal rulers. And in fact, you will notice the amazing architectural wonder that is the Taj Mahal. If you notice in this building, you see a beautiful melding of Islamic and Indian motifs in what came to be called the Mughal style. This is what you see in front of you in this picture. But this melding of styles points to another problem with the Mughals, in the fact that they never kind of blended in with Indian society. They were Persian speaking because they came from that part of Afghanistan where it was a Persian speaking population, and they very much remained sort of Persian in their orientation. They were Turkic speaking, but they adopted Persian cultural customs and motifs, as you can see in this architecture, and they never kind of fit in with Indian society. They always kept themselves sort of aloof from it. Yet another factor in explaining how the Mughals alienated much of the Indian population and weakened their own rule and sort of opened the door for the conquest by other outside forces like Europeans and ultimately the British, was the fact that their old hands-off attitude towards religion in India sort of changed, and Aurangzeb, known as World Caesar, um, who was sort of a proselytizing Mughal empire who reigned from 1658 to 1707, he did try to forcibly convert millions of Indians to the Islamic faith, and in the process alienated much of the Hindu aristocracy, the Hindu Brahmin class and Kshatriya class, that a caste that the Mughals had always used to rule over India. And by alienating these Hindu elites, by forcing conversion in India, it weakened Mughal rule. And also, you can see in this illustration of Aurangzeb being sort of carried on a what's known as a sedan chair by servants and soldiers. You can see sort of it's done very much in the Persian style and shows how much the Mughals were influenced by the Persian culture from which they came. But even with all of their actions that were alienating the Indian masses of the subcontinent, the Mughals retained a powerful military. They brought in revenues from trade with Persia and the Ottomans. Because they were part of the larger Islamic world, they could tap into the elaborate trade that existed in that Islamic world. They were able to profit. Their culture was sophisticated with lots of advances in mathematics, medicine, arts, literature. There was an urban intellectual community based on a network of coffee houses where people exchanged ideas. And so the Mughals were even though their hold over the Indian population and the subcontinent was beginning to kind of fray, they still retained an elaborate and a very sophisticated civilization. But even as the Mughals were consolidating their powers in the 1500s, early on in their rule, and building one of the most sophisticated cultures of that day, a new force was entering the picture: European traders making their way into the Indian Ocean trading network. There was an elaborate trading network around the Indian Ocean, dominated by Arabs and other Islamic traders, including Mughals. And so there was this sort of new force that was entering the picture. These were European traders, and they were beginning to kind of force their way into it. It began with the Portuguese, who had been gradually probing their way southward along the African coast, rounding the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa in 1488, and then with Vasco da Gama, the great Portuguese navigator, reaching India in 1497, 4 or 5 years after Columbus, of course, arrived in the Americas. Da Gama became very rich and famous from his exploits, his navigational exploits, merchandising exploits, and he also enriched, of course, the Portuguese monarchy, which had sponsored him. And here in this map, you can see it's a little bit light shaded, but you can see sort of all the different places, the dark dots, where the Portuguese began to install themselves and replace various Arab and local trading posts. The Portuguese kind of took them over. Indeed, the Portuguese were quite ruthless. Basically, they argued that the rules that applied in Europe respecting other countries' ships and trading ports did not apply to infidels, to non-Christians, who, of course, that's what the Indian Ocean, basin was. It was consisted of Muslims and Hindus, all of whom were not Christians. So they felt that, with infidels, with non-Christians, old rules about respecting trading ports and not attacking each other did not apply. And so they used their superior technology that the Europeans had been developing, and Portugal in the lead, superior ships and gunnery, to basically blast their way into preeminence in the Indian Ocean, taking over major ports in India and Southeast Asia. In China, they had to be a little bit more respectful of the emperor, because the emperor was quite a bit more powerful than some of the local traders around the Indian Ocean basin. But eventually they did win a concession to open up a trading port at Macau, which they would rule the longest, I believe it's the longest colonial rule in world history, which they ruled until 1999, when, of course, when Macau was returned to China, around the same time that Hong Kong was also returned to Chinese rule. And the Portuguese made a fortune in their trade in the Indian Ocean basin, which, of course, attracted other European powers, including, most importantly, initially, the Dutch. And the Dutch, with their own Dutch East India Company, not to be confused with the East India Company of the British, basically did to the Portuguese what the Portuguese had done to the Arabs. South Indian and Mughal traders. They blasted them from their ports. The Dutch had a superior merchant marine than the Portuguese, and they eventually sort of established themselves as the main power over trade in the Indian Ocean basin, taking over some of the Portuguese ports, not all of them, but some of them, and establishing new ones of their own. And of course, the legacy of that was that the Dutch would ultimately control the East Indies, what is today Indonesia, well into the 20th century. But in the constant jockeying for advantage among European powers, Dutch success in the Indian Ocean basin, of course, drew in other European powers, powers that were even greater and more militarily, more militarily powerful than the Dutch, and that would, of course, be the French and the British. The British, both the British and the Dutch, did not directly try to establish their rule directly. That is a sort of governmental rule over the trading networks and ports around the Indian Ocean basin. Instead, they relied on these sort of private companies. The Dutch had their East India Company, and the British had their East India Company. And you can see the logo of the British East India Company here. And you can sort of see the sort of overlap between trade, conquest, and the idea of Christian power in the slogan of the East India Company, written, of course, it's in Latin below, but when God commands, nothing can harm us, sort of believing that they were protected by God. And so, in effect, the early British intrusion into the Indian Ocean basin and into India itself was not sponsored directly by the state financially, as the Portuguese had been. In the case of the Portuguese, the monarch had been sponsoring the military conquest. Instead, they moved in as part of a corporation, the East India Company, which had been chartered for trade with the East back in 1600s. And of course, this was like the Virginia Company we had talked about earlier at the Americas. Was a private corporation run by investors, but investors that were extremely well connected with the British government. Many of them were members of Parliament. Many of them were people within the courts of the British monarchy. So these were people where there was a lot of overlap at the top between the investors and owners of the East India Company and the government itself. And of course, when we talked about mercantile capitalism, that was kind of the point, that the government sort of chartered these corporations to both allow investors to make money, but also to serve the interests of the monarchy and the empire as a whole. And this is a classic example, of course, is the East India Company. With a much larger economy and a much greater military power at its command, the East India Company established what are called factories around the Indian Ocean basin and in India. Now, the term factory should not be mistaken with what we consider factories today, manufacturing plants. In fact, the term comes from a factor, someone who buys and sells goods on commission. That is, the factories are places where Indian goods were brought and exchanged for European and then later Chinese goods, as the British began to move, not so much take over China, but tap into Chinese trade. Indeed, by the 1700s, China too was part of this trade controlled by the East India Company. So what the Europeans had done, and particularly the British who were leading this, was they had insinuated themselves into ancient trading networks and took control of them. In other words, they kind of took control of ports and trade routes and other things that had been long established before they came by Arab traders and Mughal traders and Persian traders, and sort of just kind of displaced them and took them over themselves. And of course, if you control trade, if you control the ships, if you control the factories, if you control the ports, you end up getting the lion's share of the profits of trade. And of course, the key source of trade in much of India was in textiles. And as we're going to talk about, in a moment. The Indian textile industry prior to the modern industrial age was the greatest textile industry in the world. No place on earth produced more textiles than India. Masses, hundreds of thousands, millions of people who hand wove cotton textile cloth that became extremely popular as an alternative to, heavy and scratchy wool clothing in Europe and around the world. And India had this massive textile industry. And at first, the British, of course, tried to tap into it by taking control of the trade in textiles. And here you can see one of the East India Company factories. This one happens to be in Gujarat, India, northwest India, from about 1740. These were, sort of walled compounds where goods were stored, where traders could come and be housed temporarily while they were conducting their trade. These were dotted the Indian coast, and they would have been established by the East India Company. Now, the East India Company, being a corporation, was not that interested in conquest or missionary work. Indeed, it told its factors, people who ran these factories, to stay out of religion and stay out of politics. But as Mughal power in India began to wane, as central authority of the Mughals began to kind of fade in India, partly because the British were stealing a lot of their financial resources by taking control of trade. And of course, other things the Mughals were doing that we talked about earlier: forced conversion, war making, high taxes to pay for those elaborate buildings, and a Persian-speaking elite that was alienated from the population. And this accelerated over the course of the 18th century as warfare and social unrest became increasingly endemic across India, as Mughal power began to fade, partly, as I said, caused by English intrusion into India and taking away profits and revenues from the Mughal government. These English factories, these East India Company factories, became not just trading posts, but heavily fortified enclaves. And you kind of see that here. You can see how this was something that was designed to protect the trade that went on within it. And what ultimately happened was that these the factors and the East India Company realized that to protect these factories where so much revenue was being generated in trade, it wasn't just enough to build big walls. They had to control the territories around themselves, providing, and so the East India Company began to sort of send out troops, many of them Indians under their own, under the East India Company leadership, and began to sort of expand territorially, providing governance, tax collection, and other things, and providing, providing domestic security in these areas. Which of course attracted lots and lots of Indians to them, because as Indian society as the Mughal rule began to sort of collapse, crime and sort of social chaos began to spread, and these enclaves that were expanding under the East India Company rule became sort of havens and refuges for many Indians who poured in, which of course enhanced trading opportunities and economic development in the areas controlled by the East India Company. So, in other words, the East India Company was kind of expanding to protect its trading systems, and then ultimately becoming more of a governing institution rather than strictly a trading one. And so, in a sense, this is how kind of British control over India began to expand in the late 1700s and early 1800s. It was not so much that it was a planned, organized effort by the British government, but just kind of a result of this effort to control trade and control economic activity, and the need to sort of create security around that. So it was kind of, the British always said that their empire in India was sort of achieved by accident rather than purpose, and there's some truth to that old saying. And what happened with a number of these factories attracting lots of people to them because they represented safety, they represented economic activity, that these factories became the kind of kernels for the development of a number of Indian cities today that have lasted down to the present day. For example, if you take the three of the four great cities of India, Mumbai, Kolkata, and Chennai, those are three of India's four largest cities. The exception, of course, is the Mughal-founded city of Delhi, which is in the interior. Mumbai, Kolkata, and Chennai are all either on the Indian Ocean or very close to it and connected to it by river in the case of Kolkata. And so to man and control these enclaves and these new emerging cities, the British recruited native troops who were trained and armed with the latest weapons. These were the so-called sepoys, Sepoys. And also, as we've talked about before, at the same time that the East India Company is expanding control over increasing territories within India, there's also the British victories in the various imperial wars of the 1700s, including most importantly the Seven Years' War of 1756 to 1763, in which the British ultimately defeated their only great European competitor that was left in India, and that was the French, so that they really had no European challengers on the subcontinent. I mean, the Portuguese held on to a couple of tiny little colonies at places like Goa, but for the most part, the coastal areas of India and Indian trade generally came under British control. But the East India Company, which was, trying to control increasing areas of India, doing this, administering large territories, administering large populations, trying to keep peace and order in these areas, is a demanding and very expensive operation. And gradually what was happening was it was sort of straining the East, as powerful and rich as the East India Company was, this was straining its resources. And so by the 1770s, the British government was moving in to administer the colony alongside the East India Company, which continued to control trade. Increasingly, the British government began to establish its own administrative control over India, even as it expanded its holdings. And the British then began to take more control over the Indian economy and over its politics, establishing government entities, getting rid of old customs and tolls. In other words, the British were trying to unify India, and getting rid of old customs and tolls, so uniting the entire subcontinent as one political unit under British control. The British also took control of key monopolistic trades, for example, in salt and opium. And the opium trade we'll talk about when we get to Northeast Asia and China next time, next week. British government also starts to collect taxes of its own. So as the Mughal Empire collapses in the late 1700s and early 1800s, the British move in as the new imperial lords of the subcontinent. And now we enter the age of far more intrusive European interference and imperialism in Asia, in British and South Asia, and we'd also see European, British, French, and other European powers in Southeast Asia and in East Asia. But we'll stick to South Asia for this lecture. What allows for this European expansion are several things. The first, of course, is the growing wealth of Europe, as bolstered by the influx of silver from the Americas, increased trade, slave and non-slave grown agricultural crops, control over an increasing amount of the world's trade, including that of the Indian Ocean Basin. And alongside this wealth comes the growing impetus of capitalism. A need for profits leads to expansion to other areas of the world. The third is the growing power of the state, partly from increased taxes and revenues produced by growing economies, which allows for expanding navies. And finally, there's the technology based on scientific advances, and we talked about the scientific revolution before, which allows for increased productivity and wealth. It also allows for new navigational capabilities, and of course allows for the development of new and effective weaponry. And you can see from this map the growing power of the growing British expansion in the subcontinent, the various areas being incorporated over the course of the first half of the first 60 or so years of the 19th century. And the English were, in fact, a kind of mixed bag for India. First, they largely worked through the local Hindu and Muslim princes from the Mughal days. In other words, they didn't try to, directly administer India itself. India has a population even then was one of the largest in the world, much greater than that of Britain. And so Britain just didn't have the manpower to rule it themselves. It was easier to administer it through local Hindu and Islamic rulers. And, this also prevents, you don't want to create unnecessary enemies. So you bring them in, you kind of link them to British rule, get them to sort of cooperate with you. Reward them some of the wealth that is being created by expanded trade, of course, but most of it goes to British traders and the British government. And the British government would eventually create a kind of an infrastructure for India, a broad, educated elite that ruled India for the British, or helped rule India, helped administer India for the British colonial system. They broke up local armies. They, they introduced ideas, some ideas about democracy. They outlawed slavery and sati, the practice of women being sort of sacrificed when their husbands died. Um, so they did some good things, but for the most part, what the British were there for was to exploit and profit off the place, and we'll talk about that now. Um, and to rule over India, they built a very large army. India is a very big place with lots of people, and they built this vast, elaborate army to maintain peace and order, and maintain their own rule in the Indian subcontinent. But this army came back to bite them. In 1857, there was a massive uprising of the Indian soldiers within the army, based on grievances about religion and other things. This massive uprising, which nearly threw the British out of India, had caused a number of British colonial administrators and their families were killed in this uprising. And what ultimately happened was the British government realized that the East India Company could no longer effectively rule India in the wake of the Sepoy Rebellion, or Sepoy Mutiny as the British called it, and began to replace it. And in fact, in the wake of the 1857 Sepoy Rebellion, the administrative and political part of the East India Company was taken away, and British rule over all of India became directly from the monarchy, directly from Parliament. And what the British did was they began to streamline the first thing they did was began to streamline property laws so as to enhance commercial agriculture. In other words, they wanted to kind of do to India what had happened in Britain, whereas local peasant holdings were consolidated under the control of wealthy Indians, and British capitalists who turned over large acreages within India to the production of raw materials, particularly cotton, that the British industry needed. And ultimately, this conversion of large parts of the Indian agricultural system from food production to the production of commercial crops for export would lead to many large-scale famines that hit India during the height of British rule from the mid 19th century to the mid 20th century. And of course, the British, for example, built the famous railroad system of India. But again, it was a railroad system that was for the same end, to allow for greater and a more effective British control over India, and for the ability to bring in goods from Britain, manufactured goods that they could sell in this now captive market of India, and to extract natural resources from the subcontinent. And in the process, they basically destroyed the Indian textile industry in the process. They placed huge tariffs on imports to England, while at the same time not letting Indians obstruct imports of cheap British textiles. And that was what was talked about in those various testimonies that I had you read as you're reading for this week and write about. And you can see the complaints in one of them, the petition of natives of Bengal to the British Privy Council, where they talk about how these imports are undermining the Indian textile industry. And then you have the rationalization by Robert Rickard's testimony to the Select Committee of the House of Lords in 1821, talking about sort of the Adam Smith idea that, India is best suited to provide raw materials, and England is best suited to provide manufactured textiles. But of course, this was not really what Adam Smith was saying, because Adam Smith was talking about, sort of natural advantages that certain areas of the world had. For example, he talked about, it makes more sense for Scotland to import wine than trying to grow it itself. But in India, it wasn't so much that India had a natural advantage in producing raw materials versus manufactured textiles, which of course bring in more revenue and are a source of greater income for the people. When you manufacture stuff, you capture more of the value of what you're making. In other words, the British basically, created conditions by force, by colonial force. They created the conditions in which they would have the advantage to sell manufactured goods, and Indians would have the advantage of producing raw materials. This was not a natural advantage. It was not had nothing to do with Indian climate or agriculture or anything like that. It was imposed by British colonial rule. Here, of course, are those documents that I was referring to. I think it is very likely that the further introduction of our cheap cotton manufacture in India may supersede the use and consumption of many of the cotton manufacturers of the country, but I'm not aware of any injury to the population of India that is likely to result from this state of things. Probably the most beneficial trade that can be carried on between India and this country will be found to consist in the exchange of the raw produce of the East for the manufactured goods of Britain. In other words, Britain is imposing this kind of trading system in which Indians produce the raw materials, which are of less value, and British are producing the manufactured good. Again, destroying the British textile industry, the Indian textile industry in the process. And here, of course, are some complaints from natives of Bengal, a province in India, in the eastern part of India. The high taxes placed on them when they tried to import them into England. England placed high tariffs on this, so the textiles from India were no longer competitive, and in the process, British ordered that in India that all tariffs be dropped and lowered so that British-made textiles could pour into the country much more cheaply, further undermining the Indian economy, the Indian textile economy, textile manufacturing economy. And meanwhile, all of this economic exploitation was rationalized and sort of not covered up, but sort of justified by the idea that British civilization was superior. And then we talked about this before with empire. They're always justifying what they're doing by saying they're bringing a superior civilization to India. And the Indians were, the British attitude was the Indians were lucky to be getting this superior British civilization. And they were, the British set up a lot of schools to train Indian administrators, but ultimately, and in the end, of course, no matter how high up and how educated local Indians became within the administration, they were always second-class citizens. They were always second-class people within their own country. The British created a system of advantage for their own colonial administrators. In India, many of them lived like princes, utilizing cheap Indian labor, servants, and so forth. The British built, for example, a network of recreational facilities, clubs, hill station, first-class rail facilities, that were, of course, were only for themselves. Even the most educated, wealthiest, and highest caste Indians were excluded from this kind of infrastructure the British created for their own people in India that was separate and above that for Indians. But one of the things that we will learn as we talk about going to sort of the nationalist uprisings of the mid 20th century, early and mid 20th centuries, that led to the end of British rule in India and the end of European colonial rule in much of the world in the middle and late 20th century, is that along with sort of educating the Indian, sort of the Indian upper classes and middle classes to help administer this empire, it's difficult to sort of teach them about it, sort of governing practices to make them more effective administrators, to make them more effective in terms of allowing Britain to rule over India. They also introduced, of course, ideas about freedom and independence that caught on among the Indian elite. They were kind of, in a sense, the British were sowing the seeds of their own rule, the destruction of their own rule in the 20th century through this educational system that they set up to create a class of people who they could use to exploit India better. And in 1885, a number of Indian intellectuals that had been educated in these British schools came together to form the Indian National Indian National Congress, which, as is typical of such organizations, the Indian National Congress first began to demand equality within a British-led India. And we'll see this throughout the colonized world, that at first the elites who are beginning to who get educated in European-run schools in these colonies, their first demands are to be treated as equals within the colonial system. And then by the early 20th century, begin to make the logical next step and say, well, why do we even need the British to be here? We need our own independence. And this was especially, made clear to them as the British began to give independence to colonial to sort of settler societies like Australia and Canada, as those were granted their independence, many of the Indian elite began to say, well, why can't we as well have our own independent countries? And so what happens is a shift from this demands by Indian intellectuals in the Indian National Congress, people like Gandhi, Mohandas Gandhi, the Mahatma, go from demanding equality within the colonial system, demanding an end to the colonial system altogether. But again, we'll talk about this more later in the semester. So last time we were discussing this issue of how we are all the products of empire, that in various, that much of who we identify ourselves as culturally, when we think it's our own unique separate culture, a lot of it has been shaped by empire, and that is definitely the case in India. And while the Indians fought for their independence, the Indians fought for their independence with British and Western ideas of nationalism, democracy, sovereignty of the people, all that stuff that emerged out of the Enlightenment. And the Indian nation itself is a product of that nationalism. In fact, the fact that Indians, had never really been united as a single Indian-ruled entity. The British created a subcontinent-wide colony and sort of helped give birth to this idea of Indian nationalism. It's very much the core of Indian identity. And for example, just in all kinds of things, Indians, for example, love their tea, but tea was originally from China and brought to India by the British and promoted by British administrators and Indian elites. Indians love cricket. In fact, they're better players than the British at this game. And so Indians may want to talk of freeing themselves of imperialist legacy, but they are continually shaped, they're continuing even down to today to be shaped by British imperial cultural artifacts. And so the imperial legacy in India is not just the railroads and tea and cricket and democracy. There's the unifying English language of India. It is the language by which sort of the Indian government rules over a country of many disparate speaking people in many languages. And even if they decided to get rid of some of these English imports, if they, for example, decide to make English no longer the national language or something like that, they would do that by, a general vote because they are a democracy, which itself is kind of an import of the British imperialism. And of course, if one could get rid of India of all the English imperial legacy, what would be left but the legacy of the Mughal and Muslim empires before it, including the Taj Mahal? In a sense, this is the world we live in, whether we like it or not. So much of our culture, including the culture of India, is a legacy of various empires that have ruled over it. And the Indians are not unique in this. And so we know that for the past 2,500 years, going through the long history of the world, from the very first empires that emerged in the Middle East, maybe even 3,500 years ago, we can come up with one thing that unites all of history. All of our development as a species is the move from small to big. We move from small groups like hunting and gathering groups in pre-agricultural revolution world. We created city-states and then ultimately kingdoms and then ultimately empires, larger and larger functions. And even today we live in a kind of a globalized world. We're sort of developing a globalized culture today that is the ultimate manifestation of this switch of this gradual evolution from small scale societies to very large. And that ends the discussion for today. Next week, in our first online lectures, synchronous lectures, in which I'm going to send you instructions via Blackboard announcement, we will discuss the impact of European imperialism in Northeast Asia with a focus on China and a little bit of discussion about Japan as well. Now, due to the disruptions of this week, there is no quiz this week and no writing assignment for next week. We're just going to kind of put things on hiatus. And then, of course, the following week, the week of March 30th, there are no classes at all. We'll be on spring break. And so we'll move forward. So look for that announcement on Blackboard about the online synchronous lecture on the Zoom platform that we're going to start on Monday morning. You'll be getting this announcement, as I said before, over the weekend. And since there's no writing assignment next week, just work on your short answer assignment number 2, which is still due on Friday, March 27th. That is a week from this Friday. And thanks for listening. See you online on Monday at 10 a.m. And again, instructions will be